Imagine becoming the most famous man in America. Imagine walking through a city and seeing your face everywhere. Imagine making millions of people laugh without saying a single word. Now, imagine that same country deciding it doesn't want you anymore. Not because you failed, not because people stopped watching your movies, but because powerful people began to fear what you represented. This is the story of Charlie Chaplin's Exile, a story that almost nobody talks about. Because most people remember the comedian, very few remember the man who lost his place in the country that made him a legend. By the middle of the 20th century, Charlie Chaplin wasn't just a movie star, he was something bigger. His little tramp character had become one of the most recognizable faces on Earth. People who spoke different languages understood him. People from different cultures loved him. Rich or poor, young or old, didn't matter. Everyone knew Charlie Chaplin, and that kind of influence is rare. But influence has a strange side effect. The bigger you become, the more attention you attract. Not all of it is positive. At first, America loved him. Hollywood loved him. The public loved him. He represented entertainment at its finest, a man who could make people forget their problems for a few moments and simply laugh. But while audiences saw a comedian, Charlie Chaplin saw himself as something more. He wasn't interested in creating empty entertainment. He wanted his films to say something. He wanted them to reflect the world around him, the suffering, the injustice, the struggles ordinary people faced every day. And that decision would slowly change everything. Because there are times when powerful people don't mind entertainers, as long as they stay entertainers, as long as they make people laugh and remain silent. The moment they start expressing opinions, the relationship changes. Charlie Chaplin didn't wake up one day and decide to become controversial. It happened gradually, film after film, message after message. His work began carrying deeper ideas. Ideas about power, ideas about humanity, ideas about freedom. And while millions admired him for it, others became uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Then came one of the most dangerous periods in modern history. The world was changing. Fear was spreading. Governments were becoming suspicious. People were being judged not only by what they did, but by what they believed. America entered a period where accusations could destroy reputations. Rumors became weapons. Suspicion became power. And Charlie Chaplin found himself standing directly in the middle of that storm. At first, the criticism seemed small. Newspaper attacks, public accusations, questions about his loyalty, questions about his beliefs, questions about whether he truly belonged. Most people assumed it would pass. After all, this was Charlie Chaplin, one of the most beloved figures in the world. Surely nobody could seriously turn the public against him. But history has shown something again and again. The higher you stand, the harder the fall can be. And somewhere in the distance, a storm was approaching. A storm that would force Charlie Chaplin to make a decision he never expected to make. A decision that would change the rest of his life forever. At the peak of his fame, when it seemed like he had everything, the country that helped build his career was slowly preparing to push him away. And Charlie Chaplin had no idea how quickly everything was about to change. The strange thing about public opinion is that it rarely changes all at once. It changes slowly, quietly, one headline at a time, one accusation at a time, one rumor at a time. And before you realize what's happening, the crowd that once cheered for you starts looking at you differently. That was exactly what began happening to Charlie Chaplin. For years, he had been one of the most admired people in America. His movies filled theaters. His name generated headlines. His influence stretched far beyond Hollywood. But influence can be dangerous, especially during times of fear. And America was afraid. The world had just survived devastating wars. Political tensions were rising. Governments were becoming increasingly suspicious of anyone who challenged the status quo. People wanted certainty. They wanted clear lines between friends and enemies. And Charlie Chaplin didn't fit neatly into either category. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a government official. He was an artist. But artists often ask uncomfortable questions, and uncomfortable questions can make powerful people nervous. One of the biggest reasons Chaplin attracted criticism was because he refused to stay silent about issues he cared about. He spoke about poverty. He spoke about human suffering. He spoke about injustice. To many ordinary people, those ideas seemed reasonable, but to others, they sounded threatening. Soon, critics began painting a very different picture of Charlie Chaplin, not as a beloved entertainer, not as a creative genius, but as someone who couldn't be trusted. The attacks grew louder. Newspapers amplified the controversy. Political groups targeted him. Public debates became more aggressive. And suddenly, Charlie Chaplin found himself defending his character instead of promoting his work. Imagine how strange that must have felt. For decades, people had watched him on screen. They laughed with him. They cried with him. They admired him. Yet now, many of those same people were hearing stories that suggested he was somehow dangerous. It's a reminder of how fragile public approval can be. People often think fame creates security. In reality, fame creates visibility. And visibility means every mistake, every controversy, every criticism gets magnified. The more famous you become, the fewer places there are to hide. Chaplin was discovering that reality firsthand. The pressure kept building, year after year. The headlines didn't stop. The accusations didn't disappear. And although he continued working, something had changed. The relationship between Charlie Chaplin and America was no longer simple. Trust was fading. Suspicion was growing. What made the situation even more painful was that Chaplin had spent most of his adult life building his career there. America wasn't just where he worked. It was where he became a legend. It was where he built his studios. It was where he created some of the most iconic films in history. Every success story seemed connected to that country, which is why what happened next felt almost impossible to believe. In 1952, Charlie Chaplin left America for a trip overseas. At first, it seemed completely normal. People travel all the time. There was no dramatic farewell, no signs that this journey would be different, no reason to believe he might never truly return. Chaplin boarded the ship believing he would come back. His family believed he would come back. The public believed he would come back. Everything appeared ordinary. But while he was crossing the Atlantic Ocean, events were unfolding behind the scenes. Decisions were being made. And by the time the news reached him, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. Far from Hollywood, far from the cameras, far from the country where he built his empire, Charlie Chaplin received information that would shock him. The message was simple, but its impact was enormous. The United States government had moved against him. The country he helped entertain for decades was no longer welcoming him in the same way. Imagine that moment. You're standing on a ship. The ocean stretches endlessly around you. And suddenly, you learn that the place you've called home for years may no longer want you back. No audience, no applause, no movie cameras, just silence, and the realization that your entire future has become uncertain. For Charlie Chaplin, that moment wasn't just political, it was personal. Deeply personal. Because after everything he had built, after all the years he had given, he now faced a question he never expected to ask. Was America still his home? Or had that chapter of his life already ended? As the ship continued moving across the ocean, Charlie Chaplin found himself heading toward one of the most difficult decisions of his life, and soon he would have to decide whether returning was even worth the fight. For most people, losing a job is painful. Losing money is painful. Losing opportunities is painful. But there is something even more difficult. Losing the place you thought you belonged. And for Charlie Chaplin, that was the wound that cut the deepest. Because this wasn't happening at the beginning of his career. This wasn't a struggling artist being rejected. This was one of the most famous men on earth. A man who had spent decades helping shape Hollywood itself. Yet now, he found himself standing at a crossroads, fight to return, or walk away. Many people expected Chaplin to battle back, to launch public campaigns, to spend years trying to repair his image, to prove his loyalty, to prove his innocence, to prove he deserved to stay. But something surprising happened. Charlie Chaplin chose a different path. Instead of dedicating the rest of his life to winning back approval, he moved forward. Eventually, he settled in Switzerland with his family, far away from Hollywood, far away from the political chaos, far away from the endless headlines. And from the outside, it probably looked like a peaceful ending, a wealthy legend living comfortably in a beautiful country. But life is rarely that simple, especially for people whose identity has been tied to one place for so long. Think about it. How do you leave behind decades of memories? How do you walk away from the country where your dreams became reality? How do you accept that the place that once celebrated you now views you differently? Those aren't easy questions, and they don't have easy answers. What made Chaplin's situation so fascinating was that he wasn't just losing a location. He was losing a chapter of his identity. The Hollywood he helped build was no longer the Hollywood he knew. The America that once embraced him was no longer the America he remembered. And perhaps the hardest part of all, he couldn't control any of it. That's a difficult lesson for anyone, especially for someone who spent his entire career creating perfection. Frame by frame, scene by scene, movement by movement. Charlie Chaplin had built his life around control over his work, control over his art, control over the stories he told. But now he was facing something no amount of talent could fix. Public perception. And public perception is one of the few things nobody truly controls. Not celebrities, not politicians, not business leaders, not anyone. Once people decide who they think you are, changing that image can become almost impossible. For years, Chaplin had been viewed as a beloved entertainer. Now, many people viewed him through a completely different lens. And whether that felt fair or unfair, it became his reality. Yet something remarkable happened during this period. Despite the controversy, despite the criticism, despite the exile, Charlie Chaplin's work survived. His movies survived. His legacy survived. Because while headlines can dominate a moment, they don't always dominate history. History tends to ask different questions. Not, what was today's controversy? But, what did this person contribute to humanity? And when people looked at Charlie Chaplin through that lens, The answer became difficult to ignore. He changed cinema. He changed storytelling. He changed comedy. He created characters that crossed borders, languages, and cultures. Long after the political arguments faded, people still watched his films. Long after the accusations stopped making headlines, people still remembered his performances. Long after the controversy lost its power, his art remained. And maybe that's what frustrated his critics the most, because influence built on popularity can disappear, but influence built on meaningful work often outlives everyone. Years passed, the noise grew quieter, the anger softened, the world moved on. But Charlie Chaplin never truly returned to the life he once had. That chapter was over, whether he wanted it to be or not. And somewhere deep inside, he understood that. The question was no longer how to get back. The question was how to live with what had happened, how to accept it, how to move forward, how to find peace after losing something that once felt permanent. And as he entered the later years of his life, Charlie Chaplin began confronting a truth that every human being eventually faces. No matter how successful you become, no matter how admired you become, no matter how powerful you become, nothing stays exactly the same forever. Not fame, not influence, not public approval, not even home. And that realization would eventually lead him to one final understanding, a lesson far bigger than Hollywood, far bigger than politics, and far bigger than Charlie Chaplin himself. As Charlie Chaplin grew older, the world that once felt so familiar continued changing around him. New actors appeared, new directors emerged, new generations filled movie theaters. The spotlight that had once followed him everywhere slowly moved on. And that's what happens to every legend eventually. Not because they become less important, but because time keeps moving, no matter who you are. For many people, that transition is terrifying. Their entire identity depends on being noticed, being admired, being relevant. And when those things begin to fade, so does their sense of self. But Charlie Chaplin had already experienced something far more painful. He had already lost public approval. He had already lost the country where he built his career. He had already watched the world change in ways he couldn't control. And perhaps because of that, he began seeing life differently. For most of his journey, the battle had been external. Building success, creating films, winning audiences, defending his reputation. But now the battle was internal. Learning acceptance, learning peace, learning how to let go. It's one of the hardest lessons a human being can face. Because we spend so much of our lives chasing control. Control over our future. Control over how people see us. Control over what happens next. Yet sooner or later, life reminds us that some things will always remain outside our hands. Charlie Chaplin spent decades entertaining millions, yet he couldn't control public opinion, he couldn't control politics, he couldn't control history, and he couldn't force people to understand him. All he could control was the work he left behind. And maybe that's why his story still matters today. Not because he was famous, not because he was rich, not because he became one of the biggest stars in history, but because his life reveals a truth most people learn too late. The crowd is unpredictable. The world is unpredictable. Public approval is unpredictable. The same people who praise you today may criticize you tomorrow. The same audience that celebrates you can eventually move on. And if your identity depends entirely on their approval, you'll spend your life afraid. afraid of losing what was never truly yours to control. Charlie Chaplin's greatest achievement wasn't becoming famous. Thousands of people become famous. His greatest achievement was creating something that survived beyond fame itself. His films survived. His ideas survived. His influence survived. Even after the controversies. Even after the criticism. Even after the exile. That's the difference between popularity and legacy. Popularity depends on attention. Legacy depends on impact, and impact lasts much longer. Today, most people don't remember every accusation made against Charlie Chaplin. Most people don't remember every headline. Most people don't remember every political argument. But they remember Charlie Chaplin. They remember the little man with the mustache, the awkward walk, the silent comedy, the humanity behind the performance. And maybe that's the most powerful ending of all. The man who was once pushed away by a country could not be erased by history, because history has a strange habit. It forgets noise, but it remembers meaning. Charlie Chaplin spent years making the world laugh. Then he spent years defending himself. And in the end, neither fame nor controversy became the defining chapter of his life. His work did. His contribution did. His humanity did. Maybe that's the lesson his story leaves behind. Don't build your identity on applause. Don't build your identity on public approval. And don't build your identity on being understood by everyone, because those things can disappear overnight. Instead, build something meaningful. Build something honest. Build something that remains valuable even after the spotlight moves on, because the spotlight never stays forever. But impact can, and that is why the world still remembers Charlie Chaplin, not as a victim, not as a controversy, not even as a celebrity, but as a man whose work outlived the noise. And sometimes, that is the